They didn't look at her belly first, they looked at her face, and decided they didn't want her. Hannah stood in the middle of Main Street with her toes numb against the slush, the icy mix of snow and mud, soaking through leather worn thin as paper. Her shawl clung to her shoulders in a way that made the cold feel sharper, the wind cutting in from the north like a blade. The boarding house door had closed with the quick, final slam people save, for stray dogs and beggars. The landlady's voice still lingered in the air, flat, unashamed, not even whispered. Plain as fence wood, she'd said, and trouble before trouble even comes. Hannah adjusted the strap of her satchel, the edge digging into her collarbone, and turned away, without a word. There was no dignity to salvage here, only movement to keep her blood from freezing. Her breath came out in quick white clouds as she stepped toward the row of false-fronted buildings, each one promising warmth she had no claim to. The saloon doors banged open behind her somewhere, spilling laughter, card shuffles, and the harsh crack of billiard balls into the cold, but she didn't look back. The town was a place of windows, faces pressed to them, watching, but none that opened. The general store sat halfway down the street, its porch offering the meager shelter of a warped overhang. She stopped there, her hand stiff and aching, and leaned toward the stovepipe, vent that coughed thin heat into the air. It wasn't enough to thaw her, but it gave her fingers the illusion of feeling. A shadow shifted inside. The door opened just enough for the shopkeeper to step out. He was a wide man with a wool vest that strained against its buttons, cheeks as red as the peppermints in the glass jar by his counter. His eyes flicked from her face to her belly, then away again, as though she were something that made him feel unclean. "Best keep moving," he said, not unkindly, but with the finality of someone taking down a sign. She straightened and murmured, "Yes, sir," in a voice soft enough to be lost to the wind, and moved on. Her hunger had been a steady, low ache for days now, long enough that it had become a kind of background noise, like the wind or the clop of hooves on hard ground. Once, she'd had work in a laundry, boiling sheets until her skin steamed and her lungs burned from the lye. The pay had been small, but enough for a room and bread. Then came the cattle drive, and the stranger with the easy smile. The father of her child had left with the spring thaw, and she hadn't seen him since. The livery stable loomed ahead, a low shape of rough boards and the smell of hay and manure spilling out into the street. It would be warmer inside, even with the animals, but she walked past for now. Pride was a stubborn thing, even when all else was worn thin. Inside the saloon, Jonah Red sat at the farthest table from the noise, his back to the wall, a chipped mug of black coffee cradled in his large, scarred hands. Whiskey was for men looking to forget, and Jonah had long since decided forgetting was dangerous work. His left hand trembled when it wasn't holding something, a habit the others in town said came from a bad whiskey habit. In truth, it was an old bullet lodged too deep in the muscle to dig out without killing him. He saw her before she saw him, through the frost-crusted window. Her shape moved steady against the wind, the edges of her shawl snapping in sharp jerks. When she paused at the general store porch, he noticed how she didn't try to step inside, just hovered near the stovepipe vent like a half-starved cat, seeking warmth from the edge of a fire. The shopkeeper's mouth moved, and though Jonah couldn't hear, he knew the shape of those words. He'd heard them plenty himself. He watched her leave, without looking back, her steps carrying her toward the livery, before she thought better of it and passed it by. He brought the mug to his lips, the coffee long gone cold, and studied the way she kept one hand low on her belly when the wind gusted. He recognized that gesture, not from tenderness, but from the need to shield. Jonah Red was a man the town didn't claim. He kept to the black horse he'd broken himself, and the stretch of land he'd built up 2 miles west. No hired hands, no family, no visitors. He was known for paying in cash and speaking in short sentences. Those who tried to ask about the war, or the wound, or the scar along his jaw learned quickly that silence was his answer. He watched her disappear into the narrow alley between the feed store and the farrier's place, the shadows swallowing her whole. Somewhere beyond that, the wind took her footprints and scattered them. The saloon noise swelled behind him, laughter edged with cruelty, the sound of a fight starting near the bar, but Jonah's attention stayed fixed on the space where she'd gone. A man who kept to himself didn't go looking for trouble. But sometimes, trouble had a way of looking like a girl with cracked hands, uneven shoes, and nowhere to go. Hannah stepped into the general store, with the wind clinging to her like a shadow. The air inside was warmer, but it carried the smell of kerosene and burlap, and the floor creaked under her weight, as though reminding her she didn't belong here. She moved toward the counter, one hand in her satchel. The shopkeeper glanced up from his ledger, his mouth already forming a frown before she spoke. She set a small silver hairpin on the worn wood. "I was hoping this might fetch enough for a blanket," she said quietly, her voice the sound of someone who'd learned to speak only when necessary. The man lifted the pin, turning it between his stubby fingers. His lip curled. "Won't fetch half that with your looks," he said, and placed it back with a little click. His eyes slid past her toward the door, dismissing her like a bad smell. In the corner, 3 ranch hands leaning against a barrel exchanged grins. One spat tobacco into a tin and muttered, just loud enough, "Some fella's mistake come to town." Another chuckled, "Bet she don't last a week." Hannah kept her gaze on the counter, scooped up the pin, and slipped it back into her satchel. She turned and left without a word, though the heat rising in her cheeks had nothing to do with the stove. Across the street, Jonah Red leaned in the shadow of the saloon's porch, rolling a cigarette he had no intention of lighting. He'd heard every word. His jaw muscle worked slow and steady, a grind of molars that was less about anger and more about deciding what anger was worth. That night, the livery was dim but warmer than the street. Horses shifted in their stalls, their breath making soft clouds in the lantern glow. Hannah sat against a post, knees drawn up, horse blankets draped over her legs. Her eyes were closed, chin tucked against her chest, as if she'd learned how to sleep without ever letting her body go slack. Jonah passed through like a shadow, the black horse's hooves muffled in the straw. He stopped near her, studied the fine trembling of her fingers in the folds of the blanket. Without a word, he placed a wrapped loaf of bread by her side, the wax paper warm from being under his coat. He didn't wait to see her find it. By morning, it was gone. In the days that followed, they passed each other like two people crossing an invisible line they hadn't agreed on. He tipped his hat once when she stepped aside to let him lead his horse past. She nodded without lifting her eyes. The bread came again the next morning, then a strip of salted beef wrapped in brown paper, then an apple small enough to fit in her palm. She never said thank you, and he never asked if it was enough. The weather changed quick that week. Clouds pressed low and heavy, carrying the kind of cold that settled in bones. Jonah was leading his horse back from the far end of town when he saw her at the pump, her shawl pulled tight, knuckles white on the handle. The wind kept stealing her strength, and the water came in short bursts, splashing onto her skirt before it reached the bucket. He tied his horse to the hitch and stepped forward. Without a word, he took the handle from her hands, his own grip steady and sure. The pump groaned, but the water came full and fast under his weight. She didn't step back. She just stood there, watching him, the wind catching the loose ends of her hair and sweeping them across her face. Her lips parted, and her voice, when it came, was soft enough he almost missed it over the wind. Do you want someone to come home to?" The question hung there, suspended between the creak of the pump and the slow gurgle of water filling the bucket. Jonah kept his eyes on the pump handle, his breathing slow. The wind moved around them in restless circles, as if it too was waiting for an answer. Jonah didn't answer her question at the pump. He only finished filling the bucket, set it on the ground, and stood there a moment as if weighing something he couldn't put into words. Then he said, "Weather's turning," and walked toward his horse. An hour later, she saw him again, sitting astride the black gelding at the edge of the street. Without a glance toward the saloon or the people watching from its windows, he tipped his head toward the open road. "Come on," he said. Not an offer, not a request, just the plain statement of a man who'd already decided. She climbed up behind him without hesitation, clutching the back of his coat. The ride out of town was silent but not tense, the sound of hooves muffled by the frozen earth. Behind them, the saloon's half-drunk crowd had pressed to the glass to watch. A ranch foreman stepped outside, spat in the dirt, and muttered loud enough for his friends. Charity cases make poor company. Jonah didn't look back. His cabin sat in a shallow hollow 2 miles west, sheltered by cottonwoods stripped bare for winter. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin and steady. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke and coffee. He set her satchel by the hearth and gestured toward a small room at the back, its door standing open. A braided rug lay at the foot of the bed, and a thick quilt was folded neatly across it. "You can stay until you find somewhere better," he said. She looked at him a moment, her face unreadable in the flicker of lamplight. "All right," she said, and that was the end of it. The days that followed took on a shape neither of them named. She mended his shirt one evening, needle flashing in the firelight, while he sat on the floor beside the stove oiling the leather of his boots. Another day, he showed her how to work linseed oil into the saddle, his voice low, his hands slow and deliberate. They spoke little, but the quiet was not the silence of strangers. It was something closer to the weight of two people learning each other's pace. They didn't speak much of the baby, but one morning, when she came back from fetching water, she found a wooden rocking chair in her room. The wood was smooth, newly sanded, and the faint smell of pine resin still clung to it. He said nothing about it, and she didn't ask. At night, Jonah would sit on the porch with his coffee, a cigarette tucked behind his ear more out of habit than intent. Through the open window, he could hear her humming, soft, almost absent-minded. The tune was unfamiliar, but it had the sound of something old, something carried from somewhere else. The thaw had not yet come when word reached him. He was at the far edge of town, buying nails from a peddler who came through with his wagon twice a month. The man leaned on the counter, speaking in that idle, dangerous way people did when they thought they were only passing the time. "Your girl's man come back," the peddler said. "Rode him this morning. Had another woman on his arm. Looked right pleased with himself." Jonah didn't answer. He paid for the nails, pocketed the change, and stepped outside into the brittle light. He found her few belongings in the livery, what she hadn't taken to his cabin: a second-hand shawl, a tin cup, a folded scrap of paper with writing too faded to read. He loaded them into his wagon without speaking to anyone. No one stopped him. Maybe they understood better than they let on. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun was sinking, casting long bars of gold through the trees. She was on the porch, rubbing her hands together for warmth. "Should I pack for somewhere else?" she asked, her voice even, though her eyes searched his face for the answer. He set the satchel down beside the door. "I already told you, weather's turning." And this time, she understood it meant she wasn't going anywhere. Winter settled over the hollow like a heavy quilt, muting the world in white. The creek froze in long ribbons, the trees groaned under the weight of snow, and the wind came low and slow, carrying the smell of wood smoke from the cabin chimney. Jonah showed her how to split logs without wrenching her back, guiding her hands on the axe handle, telling her to let the weight of the blade do the work. She listened, learned, and by the second weaker cuts were clean and straight. In return, she baked bread from a recipe written in his mother's looping hand, the paper soft and yellowed from years of folding and unfolding. The scent of yeast and browning crust filled the cabin in a way that made it feel older, as though it had been a home long before either of them stepped inside. They spoke little, their words like small pebbles dropped into a wide river, but the silences were easy now, worn smooth. One morning, when the sun was only a pale smear on the horizon, Jonah saddled the black gelding and rode into town. The streets were glazed with ice, the few people out moving with careful steps. He tied the horse at the hitching post outside the mercantile and pushed the door open. The stove's heat met him in a rush, along with the creak of the floorboards and the shopkeeper's quick glance toward him. He asked for bolts of soft cloth, cream, pale blue, and one patterned with tiny roses. The shopkeeper raised his eyebrows, but said nothing. Jonah's stare was quiet, level, and enough to make the man turn to his shelves without comment. From there, Jonah crossed to the carpenter's shop. The old man looked up from his workbench, wiping sawdust from his palms. Jonah asked for a cradle kit, oak if he had it, pine if he didn't. The carpenter nodded once and set to gathering the pieces. By the time Jonah rode out of town, The snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes clinging to the brim of his hat. No one spoke to him on the way out. Those who might have once whispered behind their hands kept their eyes lowered now. The sound of his boot heels on the boardwalk, the only thing breaking the hush. The cabin's windows glowed faintly by the time he returned. Inside, the air was warm and still, the scent of fresh bread lingering. The cradle pieces leaned against the wall, waiting. That night, the snowstorm came hard, wind slamming against the cabin like a restless hand. Inside, the fire burned low and steady. Hannah sat in the rocking chair he'd made smooth for her hair loose, the baby swaddled and sleeping in her arms. The chair moved in a slow rhythm, creak and sigh, the sound almost matching the baby's breathing. Jonah stepped inside, shutting out the roar of the storm. Snow dusted his shoulders, clung to the brim of his hat until he shook it off and set it on the peg by the door. He knelt beside her without speaking, his knees sinking into the braided rug. One calloused hand rested gently on the baby's small back, feeling the rise and fall of life beneath the blanket. They didn't look at each other. They didn't need to. The room was full enough, with the scent of bread, the warmth of the fire, the soft sound of the storm beyond the walls. In the corner, the cradle stood assembled, its edges smoothed, the wood warm under the glow of the flames. The name carved into the front caught the firelight, the shadows deepening each letter until it seemed to breathe. Home.